Well, greetings to everyone to God's Unchanging Word and this week's edition of News, Nuggets, and Insights. Today is January 27th, 17, and welcome to everyone in our audience who could be here with us today for this taping. Lots and lots of information. Top of the news this week, we have a new president, Donald Trump, the 45th president of the United States. Took office last Friday, and since that time, it has been a whirlwind of controversy. I don't want to talk about the controversy today. I want to talk about basically where we go from here. I want to talk about the presidency, the leadership, and actually there's a newsletter I'll bring out a little bit later because we're looking at godly leadership. Today I'm going to center the news, nuggets, and insights around an address given by Pastor Jeffress of I believe he's the Dallas Baptist Church, where he is from, and basically he's quite controversial on his issue on many of the stances that we as God's people in our church believe. So let me begin with a short video clip of an interview that was taken after he delivered a presidential breakfast address to President Trump on the day of the inauguration. So let's play that. It's just under 3 minutes, and I'll be back to talk about that address.
And while the day ends with the inaugural balls, it began with the traditional trip to St. John's Episcopal Church. President Trump and members of his team this morning heard a sermon there by Pastor Robert Jeffress, a very well-known Baptist preacher who was immediately hit by media critics after that, but he's used to some of that along the way. The International Business Times described him as, quote, anti-Muslim and anti-gay. CNN described him as, quote, the inflammatory pastor. He joins us now with his answer to that. Pastor, good to have you with us.
Thanks,
today. Let's start off with what you did this morning and what you talked about, a passage in the Bible that you think describes Donald Trump.
Well, the title of the message was When God Chooses a Leader. And I saw a lot of similarities between Donald Trump and another leader God raised up 2,500 years ago to restore Israel. This leader wasn't a politician or a priest. He was a builder named Nehemiah, and God told him to build a wall around Jerusalem as his first step in restoring the nation. Mr. Trump got a big kick out of that, but it was true. And I went on to talk about, Martha, why God blessed Nehemiah as a leader in restoring the nation. And so what I was trying to do was encourage not only President Trump, but his cabinet and Vice President Pence.
You know, a lot of people find it curious that the evangelical community embraced him. You know, there were plenty of other people in this race, Ted Cruz and others, who might have been a better fit for the evangelical community, but he managed to get the vote of evangelicals in a stronger way than any of them, you know, certainly did in the primaries, and that others have gotten before.
Well, the reason I supported him, and by the way, it was a year ago this weekend, I reminded Mr. Trump today that we were flying around Iowa before the first vote cast, and I said, I believe you're going to be the next president of the United States. And if that happens, it's because God has placed you in this position of leadership. I thought he would win, and the reason I supported him, Martha, is I thought he was the only candidate who had the leadership skills necessary to reverse the downward spiral of the country, but I also thought he was the only one who could win against Hillary Clinton.
So what about the criticism? And there are many people today who listened to the speech who would say that it was exclusionary and who believe that he is anti-Muslim, anti-gay, and that you represent that part of his belief system. What do you say?
Look, it is the left agenda to demonize conservative Christians because conservative Christians are the last speed bump on the road to a liberal society. And so they want to marginalize us and demonize us. If you believe in traditional marriage, you're a homophobe. If you believe men shouldn't go into women's restrooms or showers, you're a bigot. If you believe in the right of the unborn, you must hate women. I think conservative Christians are tired of being demonized. Martha, the church I pastor is not what
Conservative Christianity is coming under the gun of what the Church of God has experienced for decades. Holding true to the values of God will bring upon all that persecution. So let's take a moment now and let's look at the address that he gave. And I'm not going to cover the whole thing because it's a little lengthy for what we want here. But I want to bring out certain points about Nehemiah, tying in the address that he gave to President Trump, because there's quite a number of analogies that he brings out, and all of them bring God the credit for what's going on. However, there's one thing I would like to address that he brings out in some of his interviews, is that God sent Nehemiah to build this wall, which is not correct. Actually, God acknowledged it was Nehemiah's heart. So let me read just a few verses out of the scripture, and then I'm going to go through that address. Nehemiah 1:1 says this: "The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hilkiah, came to pass in the month of Chislev, on the 20th year that I was in Shushan the palace." So now try to imagine this. Here is Nehemiah. He's actually a captive in the palace. So he's got a high position. And he's doing very well for himself. So he really didn't need to do anything to worry about the other people. So the first thing that comes to mind when you look at Nehemiah is some of the words at the end time where God talks for his people. And it says, "Mark those who cry and sigh for the abominations of the nation." So pretty much that's where Nehemiah was in his state of mind as he was considering the escapees that were in Judah. All right, so he goes on in verse 2. "Then Hanani, one of my brethren, came, and he and certain men of Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who were left of the captivity concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant who are left in the captivity there in the province are in great affliction, reproach, and the wall in Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire." So now he's getting a clear picture of what they were going through, and he's looking at his position where he was and considering those men, knowing that that was God's nation. And so when he hears these things, he sat down and he wept and he mourned. All right, so here he is. He's weeping and he's mourning for days. All right, so it just wasn't something that happened, so it changed his whole countenance. And in fact, it affected him so bad that while he was serving the king recognized that something had changed in Nehemiah, and he said, "What's wrong?" And so then he begins to plead to the king what was going on in his mind. So God acknowledged his prayer and the fasting in the morning, and the king was so moved that he says, "Okay, you go take care of what you need to take care of." That gives me hope for our nation, because you see, now we have a powerful leader coming into office. And he's not necessarily the godly leader that we would think that God would bring in. But there's certain points in the issue that Pastor Jeffrey brings out that I want to bring out now that ties into a similarity of Nehemiah. And by the way, Nehemiah, whose counterpart was Ezra. And when we began this, we've talked about this connection way back from the beginning when we interviewed Governor Mike Huckabee, when we talked about the possibility of him going to the president and calling for a day of fast. So in essence, what you could have, especially if God brings to conversion, you have an Ezra and Nehemiah, and who knows what could happen for our nation when if that would ever take place. So there's some hope for in prayer. So now, let me begin going through just spot checking some of the information that was given in that address. And he begins with President-elect Trump. "I remember that it was exactly 1 year ago this weekend that I was with you on the citation jet flying around Iowa before the first caucus or primary vote was cast. After our Wendy's cheeseburgers." I thought that was kind of ironic. Here's a billionaire flying around and go get a Wendy hamburger. "I said that I believe that you would be the next president of the United States." And this is what caught my attention now. "And if that happened, it would be because God placed you there." You notice his mindset of what he says in this address. He doesn't give it the credit to Donald Trump because he was a powerful leader. What he says is, if you become president, it's because God did it, not because of you. And I thought that was pretty remarkable in this address going on. And he says, "And as the prophet Daniel said, it is God who removes and establishes leaders." Now, he doesn't quote the verse, so I put this in. Daniel 2:21 is where he's quoting from. It says, "He changes times and seasons. He disposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning." So what the pastor was doing, he's telling Donald Trump, listen, you're here because God did that. And it is God who will give you the wisdom on how to lead this great nation. Then he goes on to bring out 3 points in his address. Point 1, that Nehemiah refused to allow his critics to distract him. Point 2, Nehemiah refused to allow setbacks to stop him. And point 3, let me find where, point 3 here, is Nehemiah sought God's help to empower him. And then he talks a little bit about each one of them. So let me take into point 2. All right, so point 1 was pretty simple, that Nehemiah refused to allow his critics to distract him. Point 2. This is the point where Nehemiah refused to allow setbacks to stop him. Now, this is really interesting analogy to Walter Payton. For those who don't remember, Walter Payton is a Hall of Famer out of Chicago, the Chicago Bears. And one commentator says this: "Can you believe that during the career, Payton has run more than 9 miles with a football?" All right, that's how many yards he carried on the field. And the other commentator replied this. Now, this is the amazing thing when you think about it. What's even more amazing is that every 3.8 yards of those 9 miles, Payton got knocked down by a guy twice his size. But every time he got up and kept moving forward in spite of those bruising, hards, and knocks. So you never think about it on the football field when they average 3.4 yards to a carry. You're getting knocked down every time. You got to get up and get back in the huddle and go back there and do it again. So he was drawing that analogy. I thought that was pretty interesting. I've never thought of that. And I said, wow, that's pretty spectacular when you think about it and you put it to our lives as Christians today, and especially as God's church, because you see, it's like the church continually gets knocked down. Now we have to get up every day, go back to God and look to Him for guidance and go back to do the work of God again. And I want to spend the rest of this time now in part 3. Nehemiah sought God's help to empower him. He said this is Pastor Jeffress. "Nehemiah was a gifted leader, but he knew he could not succeed without God's divine help." Now try to picture this. He's standing there reading this in his address with Donald Trump, and he's drawing this analogy to Trump. So in essence, what he's telling Donald Trump, the President of the United States now, yeah, you're a powerful leader, but you need to understand something. Without God's help, you cannot do this. So that's what he said. But he knew, talking about Nehemiah, that he could not succeed without God's help. And that's why he began the great work. Nehemiah knelt before God and prayed. Right? Knelt before God and prayed. Now, there's a sentence in our interview by Governor Huckabee when we talked about the founders of our nation, how they were a nation built before God. He says this, that they were men who were on their knees before they were on their feet, which draws an analogy right back to Nehemiah, who was on his knees praying before God before he began. And this is the prayer that Nehemiah said: "O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant who delights in revering your name, and give your servant success today." That's Nehemiah 1, verse 11. He went on to say a few more things, and I just want to cover just a few more before we go on. It says, "Mr. President-elect, I don't believe we ever had a president with as many natural gifts as you. As you know, the reason I endorsed you within weeks of your announcement that you were running was because I believed that you were the only candidate who possessed the leadership skills to reverse the downward trajectory of our nation." And when he says this, he's not speaking just about the economics of our nation. This man is speaking from the heart about the spiritual welfare and the being of our nation to God. And so, in essence, what he's looking for is to take Donald Trump to possibly that God would grant him the spirit to help bring our nation back to God. And this is what this pastor is actually doing at this morning address. And he goes on to say, "And beginning with Vice President-elect Pence, a great and godly man." Now, I didn't know who Pence was when they first chose him. But from the day I seen him, I respected his demeanor, his attitude, his perseverance toward God. And we in God's church need to understand something. They just haven't been given the truth yet. But now try to imagine at some point in time, if we're near the end time and God has the innumerable multitude that's going to come out of the Great Tribulation, what people with the character like this have today, who's leading this nation, what they could accomplish. And we need to keep praying toward those ends for the leadership who are trying to follow God. So he says, Vice President-elect Pence, a great and godly man, he says, you've assembled an unbelievably talented group of advisors around you. Now, here's a warning. But the challenges facing our nation are so great that it will take more than natural ability to meet them. We need God's supernatural power. So again, he takes the man, Donald Trump, the president, and tells him, even though you're powerful, you've accomplished a lot, and all these great things that you can do, without God, you're not going to get it done. I thought that's amazing. That is exactly what I told, in not such an eloquent term as he did, but what I told Governor Huckabee. I said, at some point in time, when Donald Trump realizes that he can't get this nation out of the problem it has gotten into, would you go to the president and say that you need to go to God to call for a day of prayer and fasting? And in essence, pretty much this is what he's saying here. He's saying that we need God's supernatural power. And the only way we're going to get that is go to God on our knees and pray for God's intervention. All right, so now going on. The good news is that the same God who empowered Nehemiah nearly 2,500 years ago is available to every one of us today. Now, you ready for this? This is going to Donald Trump now. Who is willing to humble himself and ask for his help. To humble himself and ask for himself. Now, this is remarkable. When you look at the words that God inspired this pastor to give to Donald Trump for this nation, if he listened, he will realize that everything there was to take what he is, to remove himself, to humble himself, to trust God, to go forward, to accomplish. Doesn't matter how great he's done in the past. What this man is telling him, it's going to take more than you. It's going to take God. So anyway, I was very encouraged when I was seeing all of this. And the scripture that he reads right after that is in Psalms 50. He says, call upon me in the day of trouble, and I shall rescue you, and you will honor me. Amazing words in the scriptures that he's picked. There was one more psalm that he talked about making great again. Psalm 33, verse 12 says he gives us the starting point for making America great again. Blessed, and then he puts in parentheses, great. All right, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. All right, that's the point he read. Now, he cut off the sentence, but it goes on to say, if you went to the Bible goes on to say, the people he chose for his inheritance. He's talking about the nation of Israel, our nation, and all those nations, the lost tribes in Judah, all those nations that God has chose for his inheritance, and he's given it to us. So let me wrap this up, because there's a whole lot more that's in it. But I just wanted to highlight some of this, what I thought was really special to see bringing God in to this address to guide our leadership in the nation as we go forward. So he says this, President-elect Trump, I remember that it was I read this already. All right, so this is page 1, so where I was at. So pretty much I wrapped up where I wanted to be with talking about where we start at. Yeah, that's where we started at, is that if we want to make America great again, we're going to have to go back to God, to him, and that's the starting point. So anyway, I hope if you haven't seen that, you can get a copy of these words. Maybe we could even put them up on a website, on a page. I don't know. We'll see what we can do. I tried to find the video of the whole address, but I couldn't find one, so I only found the interview for it. But anyway, I thought it was worthwhile enough for you and I and all of God's people to realize that God is looking like the climate is changing. In fact, my next slide here that I'm bringing up, talking about the changing, is that there's a refreshing boldness to speak out for. All right, so now I stopped there, and then I just put some dots in, all right, to speak out for. So what's the refreshing boldness to speak out for? You fill in the blanks. What do you see, the refreshing boldness? People today are not afraid now to stand up and say, listen, I support the biblical definition of marriage. In other words, I'm against abortion. I believe in keeping the laws and the commandments of God. These things that were, if you did that in the past, you were laughed to scorn. And so across the nation, the Christians were silenced. And so what it looks like now is that God has given us the opportunity to speak up and to begin to turn things around again. How far they'll go, I don't know. But it looks like God's giving us opportunity. And we in God's church, here at God's Unchanging Word, we're going to do everything in our power to do our part to use this time wisely, because we don't know how much time we have. But if we don't, we will have wasted the opportunity to warn this generation. So I hope you'll join us and be a part of that. All right, now, I would be remiss if I didn't also talk about the warnings of things that, and I'll spend a lot more time in the future on this, but I just wanted to bring out this one thing. In the last week or two, the Republicans passed what they call the Obamacare repeal plan, but in that plan, it's actually a financial plan that's going to add, this headline said $9 trillion, but it's actually $9.7 trillion additional debt to the debt we already have over the next 10 years. So while there's many things on the horizon that look hopeful, I got to tell you, underneath the surface, the people who have their hands on the pot are still doing what they've always done. And whether they can get away with it or not, I don't know. But I'm going to tell you one thing. When you look at this $9.7, nearly $10 trillion, the rest of the world is not going to sit for that, especially if they're buying our debt and seeing the United States living high on the hog, and they're beginning to have to cut back because of the new policies. You can begin to see a tremendous amount of warnings coming from around the world, and Germany is already on the front, and many of the people in Germany are now saying that this guy is serious, that we need to begin to build our own military power. And so now you begin to see that the possibilities of leading into end-time prophecies are being laid right now, right before our very eyes, where it talks about this 200 million man army coming out of the East and Europe rising up, is that as we begin to grow the United States and protect it, the rest of the world is going to grow their interest and protect their interest at the same time. So we're beginning to see a lot beginning to shape up. How it plays out and how long it is, I don't know, but we'll stay on top of it and do our very best to keep you informed. This week, going out, the newsletter for February, and it's interesting, as Pastor Jeffress was talking about godly leadership, our newsletter was talking about the same thing. As America was looking for new leadership in America, we at God's Unchanging Word was looking for godly leadership. And we were talking about the peaceful transfer of power and the constitutional power. And we tying that into this month's DVD offering with the King Hezekiah. All right? King Jehoshaphat, not King Hezekiah. You know, I've been working on a sermon. I've been doing that even in my notes at home. Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. And I'm going to particularly deal around 2 Chronicles chapter 20. There's an incredible parallel of duality here. So this sermon is going to be another sermon that we've done in the past along the lines of lesser known men in the Bible. All right, so if I told you about King David, you can tell me a lot about his life. How many people can just, right off the top of your head, tell me about Jehoshaphat and his life? Now, we know the name. He's a revered king in Judah today. But how about his life and what he did? How about the story and the parallel of the former and the latter that God laid out there, and talking about the end-time war that's going to be with Christ, all a part of Jehoshaphat's life. We're going to be talking about that in the sermon coming up. So if you haven't got it yet, you can go online and you can request it. It'll be about 2 to 4 weeks before we go out. I've actually not even delivered it yet. I'm still working on it, but it will go out at the end of February. Or if you're on the mailing list, you're going to receive this card. Just fill it out, put your name and address on it, and send it to us, and we'll send you the DVD when it's ready. And I think it's going to be an interesting sermon. I think you'll get a lot out of it as we go through it. In just about a week, you will be getting the Constitutional Christian, Freedom by Divine Promise. Well, we've aired it. We did a live feed on it. We had almost 300 viewers at one time, and it went to 9 countries, and we have gotten tremendous positive feedback. So again, if you have not ordered it, order now, and you should be getting it within the next week or so. Also, this week online, today, if you hear his voice, chapter 3. All right, this is in this series, chapter 3 in the 5-part series. Chapter 3 is your calling. So we have the introduction and 4 parts. This particular one is called your calling. So we tie in everything together to your calling. So we got a lot going on. You got the newsletter coming out. We got the new sermon on King Jehoshaphat coming out. We got the special that's finally going to be delivered to you. So hopefully you can keep yourself wrapped around God's holy word and tied into God's unchanging word. And that's it for this week for News, Nuggets, and Insights. So I hope it's been helpful. Share it with your friends. Tell others about it. When you get the News, Nuggets, and Insight email alert, forward it to everybody you know. Let them see what's going on in God's unchanging word. And thank you again for being with us. And thank all of you for being here with us here in our studio audience. Till next week, God be with you.